September 13th, 1982. A metallic green rover descends a mountain road from Rock Aigle toward Monaco. Behind the wheel, Princess Grace, 52 years old, exhausted, complaining of a headache. Her 17-year-old daughter, Stephanie, sits beside her. Ahead, the road curves sharply, dangerously. In moments, this drive will end in tragedy, raising questions that persist decades later. To understand what happened on that mountainside, we need to go back to where it all began. The Philadelphia Girl. Grace Patricia Kelly was born on November 12, 1929, in Philadelphia's East Falls neighborhood. The house at 3901 Henry Avenue wasn't modest by any measure, but neither was it a palace. Her father, John B. Kelly Sr., had built a brick empire from nothing, rising from working as a bricklayer to owning the largest such enterprise on the East Coast. He'd also won 3 Olympic gold medals in sculling, becoming a local hero. Her mother, Margaret Major, had studied physical education at Temple University and became the first woman to head the physical education department at the University of Pennsylvania. The Kellys were Irish Catholic, wealthy, but not aristocratic. They belonged to Philadelphia society, but carried the slight taint of being new money, of having worked for what they had. John Kelly had even run for mayor in 1935, losing by the narrowest margin any Democrat had managed in the city's history. During World War II, President Roosevelt appointed him National Director of Physical Fitness. These were people who achieved, who succeeded, who didn't accept limitations. Grace was the third of 4 children. Her older siblings, Margaret Catherine and John Brendan Jr., had already established themselves when she arrived. Her younger sister, Elizabeth Ann, came 3.5 years later. Growing up, Kelly meant understanding that excellence wasn't optional. Her father's Olympic medals hung on the wall. Her uncle, George Kelly, had won a Pulitzer Prize for playwriting. Achievement surrounded her from birth. But Grace wanted something her family didn't quite understand. She wanted to act. Not in the respectable theatrical tradition of serious drama, but in Hollywood, that den of questionable morals and inflated egos. Her father disapproved. Her mother worried. In 1947, after graduating from Stevens School in Germantown, Grace left for New York City anyway. She was 18 years old and determined. She enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, working as a photographer's model to pay tuition. The modeling work came easily. Photographers loved her clean features, her composed demeanor, the way she could project elegance without effort. She appeared in print advertisements, posed for fashion magazines, and saved her earnings for acting classes. In November 1949, Grace made her Broadway debut in August Strindberg's play The Father. The reviews were mixed, but she'd crossed a threshold. She was a working actress now, no longer just a society girl playing at stardom. Through 1950 and 1951, she appeared in more than 40 episodes of live television dramas, broadcast during what would later be called the Golden Age of television. Shows like the Philco Television Playhouse, Studio One, The Clock, The Web, and Danger featured her in various roles. The work was demanding. Live television meant no second takes, no margin for error. Either you delivered the performance or you didn't. In 1951, she got her first film role, a minor part in 14 Hours. Her performance went largely unnoticed, but it put her in Hollywood. More importantly, it put her in front of Gary Cooper, who noticed her during his visit to the set. When producer Stanley Kramer offered her a role opposite Cooper in Fred Zinnemann's Western High Noon, she accepted immediately. High Noon, filmed in late summer 1951, gave Grace her first taste of what Hollywood success felt like. Cooper was already a legendary star, and the film itself would become a classic. She played Amy Kane, the Quaker wife who must watch her husband face a gang of killers alone. Her performance showed restraint, dignity, and an inner strength that audiences responded to. The role wasn't large, but it was memorable. Grace understood how to make every moment count, how to convey emotion without overplaying it. When the film released in 1952, Grace Kelly became a name people remembered. The Western's success opened doors she'd only dreamed about. Directors wanted to work with her. Studios began offering contracts. At 22, she was no longer fighting for roles. Roles were being offered to her. She continued working in television, honing her craft, learning how to command a camera's attention. The discipline of live television served her well. There were no second takes, no opportunities to perfect a line or adjust a performance. You had to be fully prepared, completely in character, ready to deliver from the first moment the camera turned on. Her work ethic impressed everyone who worked with her. She arrived early, knew her lines cold, and approached each role with professional seriousness. The modeling work had taught her how to work with photographers, how to find her light, how to present herself. The theatre work had taught her about character, about finding truth in dialogue, about connecting with an audience. Television had taught her discipline and precision. Now, in film, she was combining all these skills into something remarkable. But what came next would make her a star. The Hitchcock years. In 1953, John Ford cast Grace in Mogambo, an adventure romance set in Africa starring Clark Gable and Ava Gardner. Grace played Linda Nordley, a sophisticated woman on safari with her husband, who finds herself drawn to Gable's rugged hunter character. The role earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress and a Golden Globe Award. Suddenly, Hollywood noticed her not as a promising newcomer but as a genuine talent. By October 1953, with Mogambo's release, Grace Kelly had become a movie star. The Grace Kelly fan club formed, gaining chapters across the country. Magazines wanted her on their covers. Studios wanted her in their films. At 23 years old, she'd achieved what she'd set out to do when she left Philadelphia. Then came Alfred Hitchcock. The legendary director saw something in Grace that other filmmakers missed. He later described her as embodying sexual elegance, a quality he found irresistible for his particular brand of sophisticated thriller. Hitchcock had a type he called the Hitchcock blonde, cool, elegant women who projected refinement on the surface while suggesting passion beneath. Grace Kelly became the definitive example. In 1954, she starred in 3 Hitchcock films that would define both her career and his aesthetic. Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and later that year, though not a Hitchcock film, the performance that would win her an Oscar in The Country Girl. Dial M for Murder cast her as an adulterous wife whose husband plots to have her killed. She played opposite Ray Milland, and the production saw her engage in an affair with her much older co-star, despite his being married for 30 years. Behind her elegant facade, Grace had a private life that would have scandalized the public had they known. Hitchcock himself later told a screenwriter, "She slept with everyone." The affair with Milland became serious enough that his wife, one of Hollywood's most popular and respected figures, felt threatened. The relationship threatened to boil into a scandal that could have destroyed Grace's carefully cultivated image. The studio system, terrified of anything that might damage box office receipts, quickly moved her back to New York once filming wrapped, hoping distance would cool the affair. But the brief setback didn't slow her momentum. In Rear Window, she played Lisa Fremont opposite James Stewart's wheelchair-bound photographer. The role suited her perfectly. She was a wealthy, elegant socialite pursuing a man who couldn't see what was right in front of him. One biographer later noted that her gift didn't lie in impersonating other people. Her talent was to impersonate her fantasy of herself. She'd sensed how Lisa Fremont was her own dream, and she brought that understanding to the role with stunning effect. Billy Wilkerson, editor of The Hollywood Reporter, predicted after seeing rough cuts that it wouldn't be long before this attractive kid would be the #1 box office attraction in the world. Life magazine featured her prominently, celebrating not just her beauty, but her ability to project intelligence and wit alongside glamour. The buzz was deafening. Then came The Country Girl. Director George Seaton cast her against type, asking her to shed her glamorous image and play a dowdy, exhausted wife of an alcoholic actor played by Bing Crosby. Grace transformed herself for the role, stripping away the elegance audiences associated with her. The performance stunned critics. At the 1955 Academy Awards, she won Best Actress. Time magazine put her on its cover in January 1955, calling her the top movie star who brought about a startling change from the run of smoky film sirens and bumptious cuties. They dubbed her the girl in white gloves because she wore prim, noticeable white gloves to events. Journalists called her the Lady or Miss Kelly. She represented something different from the typical Hollywood starlet: breeding, class, restraint. She was elegant where others were merely beautiful. In 1955, Hitchcock directed her in To Catch a Thief, filmed on the French Riviera opposite Cary Grant. The romantic caper featured scenes filled with clever double entendres between the two stars. The chemistry was electric, the setting was gorgeous, and Grace Kelly at 25 was at the absolute peak of her beauty and fame. And that's when everything changed. The Prince. In May 1955, while promoting To Catch a Thief at the Cannes Film Festival, Grace received an unusual invitation. Pierre Galante, an editor at Paris Match magazine, married to actress Olivia de Havilland, asked if she would visit Monaco so he could photograph her meeting with Prince Rainier III for a picture story. The young sovereign of the tiny principality was looking to raise his country's profile. Grace Kelly, Hollywood's most elegant star, seemed like the perfect person to photograph at his palace. Grace agreed. On May 6, 1955, she arrived at the Palace of Monaco. Prince Rainier, 32 years old, escorted her around the palace grounds. The meeting had been arranged primarily for publicity, a photo opportunity that would benefit both the prince looking to raise Monaco's profile and the actress promoting her latest film. Their first meeting was cordial, but not particularly romantic. Grace later remembered being interested, but not overwhelmed. She found him attractive and charming, certainly, but there were no fireworks, no immediate sense that this would become something significant. Rainier found her attractive and charming as well, sophisticated in ways he appreciated, but neither expected what would follow. After Cannes, they didn't communicate again until Christmas. Then, during the holiday season, Rainier traveled to Philadelphia and met Grace at the Kelly family home at 3901 Henry Avenue. This visit was different. Away from the cameras, away from the palace formality and the photo shoot artifice, they could actually talk, get to know each other as people rather than as public figures. Something clicked during that visit. Something real developed beneath the fairy tale surface. Father Francis Tucker, Rainier's personal chaplain who accompanied him, later described how the prince was genuinely falling for the actress and how her family, initially skeptical about this foreign royal, gradually warmed to the idea. The courtship that developed over the following weeks was conducted largely through letters. In an era before email or video calls, they wrote to each other constantly, sharing their thoughts, their hopes, their concerns about what a future together might look like. Grace's father, John Kelly, had his doubts. As Father Tucker later explained, Kelly was thoroughly American with a capital A and wasn't sure he knew the difference between a Prince of Monaco and a Prince of Morocco. The priest had to explain exactly what type of royalty was pursuing his daughter. Monaco was a real principality, not some made-up title. Rainier wasn't some playboy with a fancy name. He was the sovereign of an actual country, small though it might be. The Kellys wanted to know what Rainier's family thought about such a match. Was this some European aristocrat looking for an American trophy wife? Or was this genuine? When Father Tucker went to America with the prince, Princess Charlotte, Rainier's mother, gave her blessing, saying all she wanted was to see her son find someone who truly loved him and whom he truly loved. The Grimaldi family needed heirs, certainly, but they also wanted Rainier to be happy. They'd watched him rule alone for 6 years since ascending to the throne in 1949. The loneliness of sovereignty weighed on him. If this American actress could love him for who he was, rather than for his title, then the family would welcome her. For Grace, the decision was complicated. She was at the absolute peak of her Hollywood career. Studios wanted her. Directors fought for her. She could command significant salaries and choose her roles. Walking away meant abandoning all of that, but it also meant something else. A chance to be something more than an actress, more than a beautiful face on a screen. She could be a princess. She could represent something larger than herself. The fairy tale appealed to her, certainly, but so did the possibility of meaningful work beyond entertainment. Over Christmas 1955, at the Kelly home in East Falls, Rainier proposed. Grace said yes. Their engagement was announced on January 5, 1956, at a press conference held at the Philadelphia Country Club. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. America's favorite actress was going to be a real princess. It was the fairy tale every girl dreamed about, actually coming true. Rainier gave Grace 2 engagement rings. The first, fashioned from family heirlooms, featured intertwining diamond and ruby circlets representing Monaco's red and white flag. The second, a Cartier creation presented later, featured a 10.5-carat emerald-cut diamond flanked by diamond baguettes. According to one version of events, this second ring was actually the one Rainier had intended as the official engagement ring. But jewelers needed time to find the right stone and create the setting. While they waited, he proposed with the family heirloom. Either way, Grace Kelly was engaged to royalty, and the world couldn't get enough of the story. The wedding of the century. April 18th and 19th, 1956. Monaco had never seen anything like it. The principality's 370 acres suddenly became the center of the world's attention as preparations began for what the media called the wedding of the century. The Napoleonic Code required 2 ceremonies, a civil ceremony followed by a religious one. On April 18, 1956, the civil ceremony took place in the Baroque throne room of the Prince's Palace, presided over by Marcel Portanier, Monaco's Minister of Justice. 80 guests attended, representing 24 nations. The ceremony concluded with the recitation of Grace's new titles, all 142 of them, in the feminine. For this ceremony, Grace wore a dress of pale pink taffeta covered by cream lace designed by Helen Rose. She accessorized with kid gloves and a matching Juliet cap. The next day, April 19th, the religious ceremony took place at St. Nicholas Cathedral. 700 guests filled the church, including Cary Grant, Ava Gardner, and Aristotle Onassis. MGM Studios broadcast the ceremony globally. They'd acquired the rights in exchange for releasing Grace from her contract, and over 30 million people watched. It was the first modern event to generate what biographer Robert Lacey called media overkill. Grace's wedding gown for the religious ceremony became instantly iconic. Designed by Helen Rose and created by MGM's wardrobe department, it required 25 yards of silk taffeta, 100 yards of silk net, 125-year-old Brussels lace bought from a museum, and thousands of tiny hand-stitched pearls. The high-necked gown featured long sleeves, a full skirt, and a train over 3 meters long. Grace wore a lace and pearl-embellished Juliet cap to hold her veil rather than a tiara, and she carried a prayer book and a small bouquet of lilies of the valley down the aisle instead of a traditional large bouquet. The dress cost $65,200 in 1956, roughly $623,000 today. Her father, John, walked her down the aisle. According to Monaco tradition, the groom entered after the bride, with trumpets signaling his arrival. They met at the altar, exchanged vows and a single ring, then knelt to pray and receive communion. The newly married prince and princess of Monaco departed the church in a Rolls-Royce gifted by the people of Monaco. A reception at the Hôtel de Paris hosted 600 guests and 3,000 Monegasque citizens. The 6-tiered wedding cake replicated the prince's palace in sugar. It was cut with Rainier's ceremonial sword. The festivities stretched late into the night, with fireworks lighting the sky above Monaco. Despite the spectacle, both bride and groom later admitted feeling overwhelmed. Rainier described it as the biggest circus in history, and said they both agreed that we should really have got married in a little chapel in the mountains. The fairy tale wedding had been beautiful, but it had also been exhausting and public in ways neither of them had anticipated. Following the ceremony, Grace and Rainier embarked on a 7-week Mediterranean cruise on his yacht. This served as their honeymoon, a brief respite from the attention before returning to Monaco to begin their life together. Grace Kelly, the Philadelphia girl who'd conquered Hollywood, was now Her Serene Highness Princess Grace of Monaco. At 26 years old, she'd retired from acting to become royalty, but the price of that transformation was only beginning to reveal itself. Life behind the palace walls. 9 months and 4 days after their wedding, Grace gave birth to Princess Caroline. The speed with which she produced an heir pleased Monaco's citizens and secured the principality's future. Prince Albert arrived in 1958, ensuring the succession. Princess Stephanie was born in 1965. Grace had done her royal duty magnificently, but Hollywood kept calling. In 1962, Hitchcock approached her about starring in Marnie, a psychological thriller about a woman with a compulsion to steal. Grace wanted to accept. The script excited her. Working with Hitchcock again appealed to her, and she missed acting more than she'd admitted to anyone. But Monaco's citizens objected. The role involved scenes they considered unsuitable for their princess. Rainier sided with his subjects. Grace withdrew from the project, and Hitchcock cast Tippi Hedren instead. It wasn't the first time she'd tried to return to acting, and it wouldn't be the last. In 1976, she joined the board of directors of 20th Century Fox, hoping to find a way back into filmmaking. She narrated The Children of Theatre Street in 1977, a documentary about Russia's Kirov Ballet School that earned an Academy Award nomination. These were small concessions to her desire for creative work, but they weren't the same as acting. Instead, Grace poured her energy into charity work and cultural projects. She established La Fondation Princess Grace to support the Princess Grace Dance Academy. In 1966, she initiated the International Monte Carlo Ballets Festival, attracting the world's leading dancers, musicians, and artists to Monaco. The festival became an annual highlight, bringing culture and prestige to the tiny principality. She founded the Monaco Garden Club, reflecting her love of flowers and providing an outlet for one of her genuine passions. Les Boutiques du Rocher sold arts and crafts made by Monegasque people, supporting local artisans and preserving traditional crafts that might otherwise have disappeared. She also founded Aimade Mondiale, a Monaco-based non-profit organization eventually recognized by the United Nations. The organization promoted and protected the moral and physical integrity and spiritual well-being of children throughout the world, regardless of race, nationality, or religion. This work mattered to her deeply. It represented something concrete, something that made a real difference in people's lives. Her daughter Caroline would later continue this work, carrying on her mother's legacy of service. To outsiders, Princess Grace led an enviable life. She had wealth beyond measure, status that opened any door, a handsome husband who publicly adored her, 3 healthy children who made her proud, and the genuine respect of Monaco's citizens. She dressed impeccably, often in outfits by designers who competed for the honor of clothing her. She carried herself with grace that seemed effortless, but was actually the result of constant discipline and awareness. She performed her duties flawlessly, never complaining, never showing strain. The Hermès handbag she carried while pregnant with Caroline became so associated with her that it was renamed the Kelly bag, becoming one of the most iconic accessories in fashion history. She was inaugurated into the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame in 1960, recognition of her status as a style icon. But those closest to her knew differently. Her daughter Caroline later noted that her mother had been incredibly tired that summer of 1982. She'd spent the season going places and doing things constantly, never stopping, never complaining about the exhaustion that must have been building. The summer had been very busy, too busy. Grace hadn't been feeling well, though she never mentioned it to anyone outside the immediate family. She wasn't in great form, but she maintained the facade because that's what was expected. A princess doesn't complain. A princess doesn't show weakness. A princess performs her role regardless of how she feels. Some biographers suggested Grace struggled with the constraints of royal life in ways the public never saw. She'd given up her career at its peak to become a princess, but being a princess meant performing duties rather than roles. There was no script that could be perfected, no director offering guidance, no wrap date after which she could move on to the next project. This was her life now, every day, forever. The palace walls that looked so beautiful to outsiders could feel confining to someone who'd once commanded Hollywood sets, who'd worked with the greatest directors of her generation, who'd won an Academy Award for her talent. The press covered her constantly, but they saw only what she allowed them to see. They photographed her at official events, looking regal and composed. They wrote about her charity work and her children. They speculated about her fashion choices and her hairstyles. But they didn't see the woman who missed acting so much she tried repeatedly to return to it. They didn't see the exhaustion that accumulated year after year. They didn't see the price she paid for maintaining perfection. In September 1976, Grace appeared at the Edinburgh Festival, returning to performing after a 20-year hiatus. The New York Times covered her appearance with interest. For a brief moment, she was an actress again, rather than a princess. But these moments came rarely, and they weren't enough. By 1982, at 52, Grace had been Princess of Monaco for 26 years. She'd raised 3 children. She'd supported her husband's reign. She'd fulfilled every expectation placed upon her. But the price of becoming a princess had been her identity as Grace Kelly, the actress. That part of her had been locked away in 1956 and never quite released. And now, in early September 1982, she was tired. Incredibly tired. She'd pushed through a busy summer of obligations and appearances, maintaining the perfect facade even as exhaustion accumulated. When her daughter Stephanie prepared to leave for school in Paris, Grace decided to drive her to Monaco herself. They'd take the train to Paris together from there. It would be a mother-daughter moment, just the two of them, before Stephanie began her new chapter. The Mountain Road. September 13th, 1982, began like any other morning at Roc Aigle, the family's country home in France, just over the border from Monaco. The working farm sat in the hills, a retreat from palace life where Grace could garden and enjoy relative privacy. Stephanie was scheduled to start at her Parisian school that Wednesday. They had train tickets to head to Paris together. The chauffeur brought out Grace's 11-year-old Rover P 63500, the metallic green car she'd driven for years despite its age. He offered to drive them, but Grace looked at the back seat. She'd brought an armful of dresses, laid across the seat. A maid had added more dresses and some boxes. By the time all the garments filled the back, there wasn't room for 3 people. Grace insisted she could drive. The chauffeur suggested he could take them and return for the dresses later, but Grace was persistent. It was only about 12 miles to Monaco, though the winding roads would make the journey take about 40 minutes. She'd travelled this route countless times. She knew every turn. What no one knew was that Grace hadn't been feeling well. She was experiencing menopause symptoms. She'd been suffering from headaches. That summer had exhausted her in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged. And that morning, as she settled behind the wheel with Stephanie beside her, she was tired. So tired. The Rover pulled away from Roc Aigle shortly after 10 in the morning. Grace navigated the first part of the journey without incident. The road descended from the hills through a series of sharp curves and hairpin turns. Local drivers knew these roads demanded attention. One section, a particularly treacherous hairpin, had earned the nickname Devil's Curse. Stephanie would later remember that her mother complained of a headache during the drive. She seemed uncomfortable. Then, as they approached a sharp curve about 2 miles outside of La Turbie, something happened. Grace said she couldn't stop. The brakes didn't work. She was in a complete panic. Stephanie grabbed the handbrake, pulling hard, but the car wouldn't stop. She tried desperately, but she couldn't stop the car. Another driver on the road that morning noticed the Rover ahead behaving strangely. It seemed to accelerate when it should have been slowing for the curve. The concerned driver honked several times, trying to get the attention of what he assumed was a drunk or sleepy driver. But the Rover kept going, faster now, heading straight for the hairpin turn known as Devil's Curse. The car missed the curve entirely. It crashed through the stone barrier and careened down the 120-foot hillside, clipping treetops as it tumbled down the slope. A local gardener working nearby heard the terrible sound of the crash. He ran to the scene and found the wrecked vehicle resting against a tree near the bottom of the hill, close to a pile of rocks. Stephanie had somehow extricated herself from the wreckage. She was yelling, desperate, frantic. Her mother was still in the car. She needed help getting her out. The gardener could see that the situation was dire. Princess Grace was unconscious, trapped in the mangled Rover. Emergency responders arrived and smashed the vehicle's rear window to remove Grace. Both she and Stephanie were taken to Monaco Hospital. The injuries were severe. Grace had suffered trauma to the brain and thorax, multiple fractures of the collarbone, thigh, and ribs, and a fractured femur. But the worst damage was internal, invisible to those first responders who carefully loaded her into the ambulance. At the hospital, doctors performed surgery on her lungs to stop internal bleeding. A CAT scan revealed the terrible truth. Shortly before the accident, Grace had suffered a stroke. The cerebrovascular incident had rendered her unable to control the vehicle. She hadn't crashed because of mechanical failure or inattention. Her brain had betrayed her at the worst possible moment. Stephanie had sustained a hairline fracture in her spine and other minor injuries. She'd been lucky. Grace had not. But the palace, fearing the worst, began controlling the narrative in ways that would haunt them. Rather than announcing the severity of Grace's condition, they issued statements suggesting she had suffered a few broken bones and would recover. They told palace staffers to continue their vacations. Palace spokesperson Nadia Lacoste was herself on vacation, limiting the accurate flow of information through proper channels. The initial public announcement said Princess Grace had suffered a minor brain hemorrhage but would make a full recovery. Even Grace's brother John Kelly in Philadelphia was led to believe she was out of danger based on these communiques. The hospital's chief surgeon would later call these statements garbage to the New York Times, explaining that the communications were administrative ones rather than medical bulletins. The reality was far grimmer. Grace never regained consciousness after arriving at the hospital around 10:30 that morning. Doctors gave her zero chance of recovery. She'd suffered 2 strokes, one before the accident that caused the crash, and another more severe one shortly after, likely caused by the impact. She was technically brain dead. For 36 hours, the world believed Princess Grace would survive. Friends and family made plans to visit. Well-wishers sent flowers and cards. Monaco's citizens prayed for their princess. Then, on September 14, 1982, at 10:55 p.m., Prince Rainier made the agonizing decision to remove his wife from life support. Her Serene Highness Princess Grace of Monaco was declared dead. She was 52 years old. Aftermath. The announcement shocked the world. Just that afternoon, reports said she was stable with broken bones. Now she was dead. Rumors erupted immediately. Was Stephanie driving? One witness claimed to see her behind the wheel. She was extracted from the driver's side and had no license. But Stephanie always denied it, later expressing the pain of accusations born from people's belief that her mother was too perfect to do something so human as to crash a car. Other theories surfaced. Had they been arguing about Stephanie's boyfriend, Paul Belmondo, mafia involvement? Prince Rainier dismissed the conspiracy theories entirely. The truth was simpler and sadder. Dr. Louis Chatelain and other doctors confirmed Grace had suffered a stroke while driving, rendering her unable to control the car. She was brain dead almost immediately upon arrival. No mystery. No conspiracy, just a medical catastrophe at the worst possible moment. September 18th, 1982. Over 400 mourners attended Grace's funeral at the same cathedral where she'd married Rainier 26 years earlier. Cary Grant, Nancy Reagan, Diana Princess of Wales, and others gathered as 100 million watched worldwide. Stephanie, still recovering from her injuries, couldn't attend her own mother's funeral. The 17-year-old grieved alone, haunted by trauma and undeserved accusations. Grace was laid to rest in the Grimaldi family vault. The crushed rover was taken to sea and sunk in the Mediterranean, taking the physical evidence with it. Prince Rainier never remarried. When he died in 2005, he was buried alongside her, reunited with his greatest love. The price she paid. 2 months before her death, Grace Kelly gave what would be her final interview. The journalist asked her how she would like to be remembered. Her answer was simple and telling. "I would like to be remembered as someone who accomplished useful deeds and who was a kind and loving person. I would like to leave the memory of a human being with a correct attitude and who did her best to help others." No mention of Hollywood. No mention of her films or her Oscar or her legendary beauty. She wanted to be remembered for kindness, for usefulness, for helping others. After 26 years as Princess Grace, perhaps that's what mattered most to her. Or perhaps it was what she'd learned to tell herself mattered most. The life Grace Kelly lived as Princess Grace represented everything she'd given up to wear a crown. She'd walked away from Hollywood at the peak of her fame, at 26, with an Oscar and unlimited possibilities ahead of her. She'd traded that for palace walls, for official duties, for the constraints of royal protocol. She'd produced heirs, supported her husband, served Monaco faithfully. But she'd locked away the part of herself that sparkled on screen, that transformed under Hitchcock's direction, that won Academy Awards and captured millions of hearts. That summer of 1982, exhausted and unwell, driving her daughter down a mountain road she'd navigated countless times before, Grace Kelly paid the final price for becoming a princess. The stroke that stole her life might have been caused by exhaustion, by stress, by the accumulated toll of decades spent performing a role she never quite chose, in the same way she'd chosen her Hollywood roles. James Stewart, who'd starred with her in Rear Window, gave this eulogy at the private memorial service held in Beverly Hills. "You know, I just love Grace Kelly. Not because she was a princess, not because she was an actress, not because she was my friend, but because she was just about the nicest lady I ever met. Grace brought into my life as she brought into yours, a soft, warm light every time I saw her, and every time I saw her was a holiday of its own." Cary Grant, who'd named her his favorite co-star, was devastated by her death. Friends said it hit him harder than the deaths of Louis Mountbatten, Alfred Hitchcock, or even Ingrid Bergman. The loss of Grace represented something larger than the passing of a friend. It represented the end of an era, the final chapter of Hollywood's golden age. Today, Grace Kelly remains iconic. In 1993, both the United States and Monaco released commemorative postage stamps bearing her image. Though U.S. federal law forbids depicting foreign heads of state, so the American stamp listed her as Grace Kelly, while the Monaco stamp called her Princess Grace. In 2007, Monaco hosted an exhibition honoring her, displaying letters, personal belongings, fashion accessories, and sound recordings. The Princess Grace Foundation, established after her death, continues supporting emerging theatre, dance, and film artists in America, having awarded nearly 800 artists at over 100 institutions. The Kelly bag remains one of Hermès's most iconic products, forever associated with the actress-turned-princess who carried it to shield her pregnant belly from photographers. Les Ballets de Monte Carlo, established in 1985 according to her wishes, continues performing. Her charitable work persists through her children, particularly Carolyn, who carries on A Maid's mission. But the questions linger. What might Grace Kelly have accomplished if she'd stayed in Hollywood? What roles might she have played in her 30s, 40s, 50s? Would she have transitioned to character work, to directing, to producing? Would she have been happy continuing to act? Or would she have always wondered what it would have been like to be a princess? The road from Rock Aigle to Monaco remains. The curve where her car left the road still exists, though new guardrails have been installed. The stretch of highway appeared in To Catch a Thief, one of her Hitchcock films, a strange coincidence that adds another layer to the tragedy. Grace drove that road countless times. She knew every turn. Until the morning when her brain failed her at the worst possible moment, sending her tumbling down a mountainside and ending one of Hollywood's greatest fairy tales. The price of becoming a princess, for Grace Kelly, was everything. Her career, her identity as an actress, and ultimately, her life. The fairy tale ended not with happily ever after, but with a car crash on a mountain road. A 52-year-old woman exhausted from playing a role for 26 years. And a world left wondering what might have been if she'd never left Hollywood at all. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. June 4th, 1952. Plaza de Mayo, Buenos Aires. Hundreds of thousands gathered to see their beloved Evita at Juan Perón's second inauguration. The woman who appeared was almost unrecognizable. Beneath her fur coat, a frame of plaster and wire held her upright. At 33, Eva Perón was sustained only by pain medication. The crowds waved and cheered, unaware their spiritual leader was dying. What happened in her final months would become one of the most controversial medical stories of the 20th century. The descent of Argentina's golden icon wasn't just about illness. It was about power, desperation, and how far those around her would go to keep the illusion alive. The girl who escaped the Pampas. To understand how devastating Eva's fall was, you have to understand how high she had climbed from. She wasn't born into power. She clawed her way toward it from the dust and poverty of rural Argentina. Maria Eva Duarte was born on May 7th, 1919, in the small town of Los Toldos on the Argentine Pampas. She was the youngest of 5 children, born to a relationship that was never formalized. Her father, Juan Duarte, maintained his legitimate family in another town while spending months each year with Eva's mother, Juana Ibarguren, and their children. When Eva's father died in a car accident when she was 6 years old, the rejection was complete. The legitimate family wouldn't even let Juana and her children attend the funeral properly. They stood outside, unwelcome. That humiliation, that sense of being unwanted by respectable society, would shape everything Eva became. The family moved to Junín, struggling financially, living on the margins. Eva grew up watching her mother work herself to exhaustion, watching her older siblings try to make something of themselves, despite the stigma of illegitimacy. And she decided that this life, this grinding poverty and social rejection, would not be her future. At 15 years old, in 1934, Eva left for Buenos Aires. The details of how she made that journey have been romanticized and disputed over the years. But what matters is this. A teenage girl from the provinces arrived in Argentina's capital with nothing but ambition and an absolute refusal to go back. She found work as a model first, then small roles in B-movies. The work was inconsistent, the pay was terrible, and the competition was fierce. But Eva had something that transcended conventional beauty. She had presence, she had determination, and she was willing to work harder than anyone else. Her real breakthrough came in radio. By the early 1940s, she had steady work as a radio actress, performing in soap operas and dramas. She wasn't a star, not yet, but she was making a living in Buenos Aires, which was more than most girls from Los Toldos ever achieved. She bleached her hair blonde. She cultivated a certain style. She was building herself into something new. And then, on January 22nd, 1944, at a charity event for earthquake victims at Luna Park Stadium, she met Colonel Juan Domingo Perón. He was 48 years old, twice her age, and one of the most powerful men in Argentina's military government. She was 24, a radio actress with provincial roots. By all conventional measures, they should have had nothing to say to each other. But something clicked that night. Juan Perón saw in Eva a woman who understood struggle, who connected with the working class in ways he couldn't, who had the charisma and media savvy that modern politics was beginning to demand. Eva saw in Perón a path to real power, to the kind of position where she could never be humiliated again. The next morning, Eva arrived at work in a limousine reserved for the War Ministry. Their relationship wasn't subtle. And it wasn't without consequences when the actress became a force. In October 1945, rival military factions arrested Perón and briefly imprisoned him. It was meant to end his political career. Instead, it became his launchpad to the presidency. The coup against Perón came from officers who saw him as too friendly to Labour, too populist, too willing to upset the traditional power structures that had governed Argentina for generations. They locked him away and waited for his support to crumble. Eva rallied support while he was in prison. She worked with the labor unions, helping to organize the massive demonstration of October 17th that forced Perón's release. The exact extent of her role has been debated by historians, but what's certain is that by the time Perón walked free, Eva wasn't just his mistress anymore. She was his political partner. They married 9 days after his release. In the civil ceremony in Junín, Eva became Eva Perón. When Juan won the presidency in February 1946 with 54% of the vote, Eva became First Lady at 27 years old. And she didn't approach the role the way anyone expected. Traditional Argentine society thought a First Lady should be decorative and quiet, focusing on charity work and social events. The upper class, the old families with their established wealth and European pretensions, expected Eva to know her place. They saw her as an upstart, an illegitimate nobody who had slept her way to power. They whispered about her past as an actress, implying that her only talents were theatrical. Eva didn't care what they thought. She never had. She had spent her childhood being told she didn't belong, being reminded that illegitimate children didn't deserve the same respect as those born into proper families. The rejection had hardened her, taught her that the opinions of the elite meant nothing if you had the people's support. She took over labor relations, meeting with union leaders for hours, awarding generous wage increases, building political support for Perón among the working class. She didn't just sign documents and pose for photos. She sat in rooms with men who had spent their lives in factories and mines, and she listened to them. She understood their grievances because she had lived their struggles in different forms. She cut off government funding to the Sociedad de Beneficencia, the traditional charity organization run by aristocratic women who had snubbed her, who had made it clear that a woman of her background would never be welcome in their circles. And she created her own foundation instead. The Eva Perón Foundation became her power base. Funded by mandatory union contributions, business donations, and a substantial cut of the national lottery, it built thousands of hospitals, schools, orphanages, and homes for the elderly. Eva personally oversaw much of this work, often meeting with poor Argentines who came seeking help. The scale of the foundation's work was staggering. Between 1948 and 1952, it distributed food, clothing, and medicine to millions. It built entire neighborhoods, including a community called Evita City. It provided scholarships for students who never could have afforded education otherwise. It operated mobile medical clinics that reached rural areas that had never seen a doctor. But the foundation also operated without transparency. There were no public audits, no oversight boards. Eva controlled everything personally. Critics accused her of embezzlement, of using foundation money to fund her lavish wardrobe and jewelry collection. The accusations were probably unfair in some ways and accurate in others. The truth was that Eva saw no contradiction between building hospitals for the poor and wearing Dior gowns to state dinners. She would work 20 to 22 hours a day sometimes, ignoring Perón's requests that she take weekends off. People would line up to see her, to ask for assistance, to tell their stories. And Eva listened. She gave them money, found them housing, arranged medical care, provided what the government and traditional charities had always denied them. There are stories of her meeting with people until 3 or 4 in the morning, refusing to leave while anyone was still waiting. Of her rage when she encountered incompetence or delays in helping someone who needed it. Of her crying at the stories she heard, then composing herself and making sure solutions were found. To the descamisados, the shirtless ones, the working-class Argentines who had never had political power before, Eva was a saint. She was proof that someone who came from nothing could rise to everything. She spoke their language, she understood their struggles, and she fought for them with a ferocity that bordered on fanatical. To her critics, she was dangerous, authoritarian, using the foundation as a personal slush fund while she wore Dior gowns and dripped with jewels. The hypocrisy of a woman preaching to the poor while living in luxury wasn't lost on anyone. But Eva had learned something from her childhood years of poverty. Power and image were intertwined. The gowns, the jewels, the perfectly styled hair weren't about vanity. They were armor. They were proof that a girl from Los Toldos could stand on the world stage and belong there. In 1947, she embarked on what became known as the Rainbow Tour, visiting Spain, Italy, France, and Switzerland. She met with Francisco Franco and Pope Pius XII. She wore elaborate outfits that cost fortunes and gave speeches that mixed glamour with populist rhetoric. The European press didn't quite know what to make of this glamorous, outspoken Argentine First Lady. The tour began in Spain, where Franco rolled out the red carpet for the Argentine First Lady. She was greeted with massive crowds and elaborate ceremonies. The Spanish government awarded her the Order of Isabella the Catholic. For a woman who had grown up as an outsider in her own country, being honoured by European heads of state must have felt like vindication. In Italy, she met with Pope Pius XII in a private audience. She wore black, as protocol demanded. But the dress was couture, the jewellery magnificent. She presented herself as both humble and powerful, a contradiction she had perfected over years of navigating between the working class and the elite. In France and Switzerland, the reception was cooler. The European aristocracy and old money looked down on this South American upstart with her nouveau riche style and populist politics, but Eva had never needed their approval. The tour was about projecting Argentina's power and her own importance on the world stage. But back home, her popularity was undeniable. By 1951, the working-class Peronist base was clamoring for Eva to run for vice president. She was more popular than Perón in many quarters. The thought of actually having formal political power, of being vice president, seemed within reach. Eva had also been instrumental in achieving one of her most significant accomplishments, women's suffrage. In 1947, Argentina finally granted women the right to vote. Eva had lobbied for this tirelessly, using her influence and the Foundation's resources to push the legislation through. When the law passed, she formed the Female Peronist Party in 1949, creating an organized political force of women loyal to the movement. She understood that giving women political power wasn't just about rights. It was about building a base of support that would sustain Peronism for generations. The women who voted for the first time in 1951 did so largely for Juan Perón, thanks to Eva's organizing and outreach. And that's when her body started to fail her. The bleeding wouldn't stop. It started with fainting. On January 9th, 1950, Eva fainted in public. Officially, the story was appendicitis. She underwent surgery 3 days later, and the removed appendix was presented as the cause of her problems. But that wasn't the truth. During that surgery, doctors found advanced cervical cancer. They didn't tell Eva. On Juan Perón's orders, the diagnosis was withheld from her and from the public. Some historians believe Perón kept it quiet for political reasons. Eva's power and popularity were crucial to his presidency. Any sign of weakness might affect the upcoming 1951 election. Others think he genuinely wanted to protect her from the devastating news. Either way, Eva continued working, unaware of what was growing inside her. The fainting continued throughout 1951. The vaginal bleeding became profuse, impossible to hide from those close to her. She would be giving speeches and have to stop, her strength suddenly gone. In August 1951, during one of the massive rallies where the Peronist faithful gathered to demand she run for vice president, Eva addressed the crowds from the balcony of the Casa Rosada. She told them she needed time to think about the nomination. The truth was simpler and more brutal. She was too sick to campaign. On August 31st, 1951, Eva finally made her decision public. She would not run for vice president. She called it the renunciation, framing it as a personal sacrifice for the movement. But anyone paying attention could see she was becoming thinner, weaker, struggling to maintain the facade. In November 1951, Eva was told she needed surgery. A hysterectomy, they said, to stop the bleeding. What she didn't know was that an American cancer surgeon, Dr. George T. Pack, had been secretly brought to Argentina to perform the operation. On November 5th, Eva was taken into the operating room. The Argentine surgeon Ricardo Finocchietto, whom she trusted, was supposed to perform a routine procedure. But once she was under anesthesia, Dr. Pack took over. He found extensive cervical cancer that had already spread throughout her abdomen. He did what he could, removing her uterus and as much of the diseased tissue as possible. Before Eva woke up, Dr. Pack was on a plane back to New York. When she came out of anesthesia, they told her the bleeding problem had been corrected. They did not tell her she had cancer. They did not tell her the cancer had metastasized. They did not tell her she was dying. Eva went back to work, because that's what she did. The foundation needed her. The people needed her. And maybe, on some level, she knew that if she stopped moving, stopped working, stopped fighting, it would all be over. But the recovery from surgery was slower than expected. She didn't regain her strength. The pain didn't go away. And by early 1952, it was becoming harder and harder to hide how sick she really was. The body consumes itself. By spring 1952, Eva was experiencing symptoms she couldn't ignore. Persistent cough that left her breathless, chronic pain that radiated through her body, starting in her abdomen and spreading until there was no position, no medication, no moment of comfort. Weight loss that made her clothes hang loose, that turned her famous curves into sharp angles. The cancer had spread to her lungs and other organs. Every breath was becoming harder. Every movement sent waves of pain through her system. And still, she tried to work. She was receiving drug therapy and radiation treatment. The radiation burned her skin, left her nauseated and weak. In a medical first for Argentina, they tried chemotherapy, administering nitrogen mustard in a desperate attempt to slow the disease. The nitrogen mustard was a derivative of chemical weapons from World War I, repurposed to kill cancer cells. It also killed healthy cells, destroyed her immune system, made her violently ill. Nothing worked. The cancer was too advanced, too aggressive. It had been growing for years before anyone acknowledged it, and by the time treatment began, it was already too late. Eva became emaciated. By June 1952, she weighed only 79 pounds. Her face, once full and glowing in photographs, became gaunt. The bones of her skull visible beneath skin that seemed stretched too tight. Her iconic blonde hair required constant maintenance to hide how it was thinning from the chemotherapy and radiation. The makeup artists worked overtime to create the illusion of health when she had to appear in public, applying layers of foundation and powder to hide the greyish tint her skin had taken on. But the physical deterioration was only part of the story. Eva's behavior was changing too. She exhibited increasing bouts of anxiety, agitation, emotional instability. She would rage against her political enemies with a viciousness that shocked even her closest allies. The woman who had always been passionate in her politics now seemed consumed by fury, unable to modulate her responses or control her temper. The pain medication she was taking might have contributed to the personality changes. She was on heavy doses of opiates, and the side effects included mood swings, paranoia, and difficulty thinking clearly. But there was also something deeper happening. Eva knew she was dying, even if no one would tell her explicitly. She could feel her body failing, and the terror of that, combined with the physical agony, was breaking down the iron control she had maintained for so many years. In her last major speech on May 1st, 1952, addressing the crowds from Plaza de Mayo, Eva was visibly frail but defiant. She had to be helped to the balcony. Her voice, once so strong and commanding, was weak and raspy. But she spoke with the same fire, telling the gathered masses that she would always be a rainbow of love between them and Perón. But she also spoke about her enemies with barely controlled fury, threatening those who opposed Peronism, speaking of violence and retribution in ways that made Juan Perón's advisors nervous. From her sickbed, she reportedly attempted to organize armed workers' militias. The woman who had built schools and hospitals was now talking about violence, about crushing opposition, about defending the movement by any means necessary. Juan Perón was watching his wife unravel. The doctors told him she was in constant, agonizing pain. The medications weren't enough anymore, and her increasingly erratic behavior was becoming dangerous, politically and socially. That's when the decision was made. A decision that would remain hidden for decades. The procedure never explained. In May or early June 1952, an American neurosurgeon arrived in Buenos Aires. His name was Dr. James Poppen, and he was an expert in a particular type of surgery, prefrontal lobotomy. At the time, lobotomy was considered a legitimate treatment for chronic pain from cancer. It was also used to manage what doctors called difficult behavior, particularly in patients who were agitated or aggressive. Dr. Poppen had experience with both applications. The medical team treating Eva included Dr. Riccardo Finocchietto and Dr. George Udvarhelyi, among others. Juan Perón had given them clear instructions. Make sure she doesn't suffer, and please try to calm her down. What happened next has been pieced together from medical records, travel logs, eyewitness accounts, and analysis of Eva's skull X-rays conducted years later. Eva was told she needed another procedure to help with the pain in her neck and spine. Dr. Finocchietto informed her that they would sever the nerve causing the problem. She trusted him. She agreed to the surgery. But what they actually performed was a prefrontal lobotomy. They drilled 2 small holes in her frontal bone and severed connections in her brain, destroying tissue in her frontal lobe. The procedure was intended to reduce her pain perception and, likely, to modify her behavior and personality. She was never told what they had actually done to her. After the surgery, Eva's behavior changed. She became quieter, more docile. She also stopped eating. The woman who had worked 20-hour days, who had fought with the ferocity of someone who had everything to prove, seemed to disappear behind her own eyes. But she had one more public appearance to make, one more performance for the Argentine people who loved her. The final parade, June 4th, 1952, Juan Perón's second inauguration. Eva insisted on being there, on riding in the open car beside her husband through the streets of Buenos Aires. The doctors were against it. She was too weak. The exposure to the elements could worsen her condition. Eva didn't care. The people needed to see her, and she needed to see them. So they constructed the frame of plaster and wire that would allow her to stand. They dressed her in the fur coat that would hide how skeletal she had become. They gave her the triple dose of pain medication that would get her through the parade. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets. They cheered for Evita, their saint, their champion. They saw what they wanted to see. Their first lady, elegant and strong, standing beside the president. They didn't see the wire cage holding her up. They didn't see the pain medication coursing through her system. They didn't see the woman who weighed less than 80 pounds, whose body was being consumed by cancer, and the treatments meant to fight it. The parade lasted hours. Eva smiled and waved. She performed her role perfectly, one last time. When she returned home, she took another 2 doses of medication and collapsed. That was her final public appearance. From then on, Eva Perón remained hidden from public view, confined to her bed in the presidential residence. The cancer continued its work. By mid-July, she was drifting in and out of consciousness. The doctors could do nothing more except manage her pain and wait. On July 26, 1952, at 8:25 p.m., Eva Perón's heart stopped. The 33-year-old First Lady of Argentina, spiritual leader of the nation, champion of the descamisados, died in her bed at the Unzué Palace. Radio broadcasts across the country were interrupted immediately. The announcement went out. The wife of the president, spiritual leader of the nation, had passed away. Argentina went into mourning, and the mourning was genuine, overwhelming, a collective grief that brought the country to a standstill. 13 days of tears. The government declared an official period of mourning. All activities were suspended. Flags flew at half-mast across the nation, and the people came to say goodbye. Before Eva died, Juan Perón had made arrangements with Dr. Pedro Ara, a Spanish pathologist who specialized in embalming. Ara was considered one of the best in the world at his craft. Perón wanted Eva preserved perfectly, not just for burial, but for permanent display. She was to be Argentina's eternal saint, forever young, forever beautiful. Ara needed to begin his work within hours of death to achieve the preservation Perón wanted. As soon as Eva's heart stopped, he began the process. This wasn't ordinary embalming. Ara spent over a year working on Eva's body, replacing her blood with glycerin and other preservative chemicals, treating her skin and tissues to prevent any decomposition. While Ara prepared the body for initial viewing, Eva's hairstylist dyed her hair blonde one last time. Her manicurist painted her fingernails with clear polish. They dressed her in a white dress and laid her out for public viewing at the Ministry of Labour building, the place where she had met with workers and union leaders, where she had built her political base. The building itself held symbolic importance. This was where Eva had spent countless hours listening to the descamisados, where she had distributed aid, where she had wielded her unofficial but very real political power. Bringing her body here was a way of returning her to the people she had served. The lines to view her body stretched for blocks in multiple directions. Hundreds of thousands of people waited, some for an entire day, to pass by her coffin. They touched it. They kissed it. They wept. Some collapsed in grief and had to be carried away by medical personnel who had been stationed throughout the viewing area. The scenes were unprecedented. People fainted from standing too long in the heat. Mothers brought their children to touch the coffin, wanting them to remember this moment. Workers who had received help from the foundation came to thank her one last time. Women who had voted for the first time thanks to Eva's advocacy came to mourn the woman who had changed their lives. For 13 days, this continued. The government finally had to end the public viewing because the exposure was beginning to damage the corpse despite Ara's preservation efforts. But even 13 days wasn't enough for everyone who wanted to pay their respects. People were still lined up when the announcement came that the viewing had to stop. On August 9th, Eva's body was transferred to the Congress building for an additional day of viewing, this time for government officials and dignitaries. The next day, after a final mass, her coffin was placed on a gun carriage and pulled through the streets by CGT labor officials. The funeral procession included Juan Perón, his cabinet, Eva's family, representatives of the female Peronist party she had founded, workers, nurses, and students from the Eva Perón Foundation. Millions lined the streets. Eva Perón was given a state funeral, a privilege usually reserved for heads of state. She had never held any official government position. But to the people who mourned her, titles didn't matter. She had been their voice, their champion, their Evita. After the funeral, Dr. Ara continued his embalming work. It took over a year to complete the process. He replaced her blood with glycerin and other preservatives. He left her internal organs intact, which was unusual but necessary for the level of preservation Perón wanted. The plan was to build a monument larger than the Statue of Liberty, where Eva's embalmed body would be displayed permanently, a testament to her legacy, a shrine for the movement she had helped build. But that monument was never built, because 3 years later, in 1955, Juan Perón was overthrown by a military coup, and Eva's body became a political pawn in Argentina's bitter divisions. The body that wouldn't rest. After Perón was overthrown, the new military government saw Eva's preserved corpse as a symbol of everything they wanted to erase. Peronism was banned. Displaying images of Eva or Juan Perón became illegal, and her body, kept in the CGT building, became a problem. The military couldn't destroy it. Even anti-Peronists understood that making a martyr of her corpse would only strengthen the movement they were trying to suppress. So they decided to make it disappear. In 1955, Eva's body was secretly stolen from where it was being kept. For years, no one knew where it had gone. Rumors circulated. Some said it had been thrown into the river. Others claimed it was buried at sea. The truth was stranger. The body was taken to Italy and buried in a cemetery in Milan under a false name, Maria Maggi de Magistris. For 16 years, Eva Perón lay in an unmarked grave in a foreign country, far from the people who had loved her. The military's plan backfired spectacularly. Rather than erasing Eva's influence, hiding her body turned her into a legend. She became a symbol of resistance for groups fighting against military rule. The Montoneros, a guerrilla organization, even kidnapped and killed a former president, General Pedro Aramburu, demanding to know where Eva's body was hidden. In 1971, bowing to pressure and desperate to stabilize the country, the military government returned Eva's remains to her exiled widower. Juan Perón was living in Madrid. When he opened the coffin, he found that Dr. Ara's work had held up remarkably well. Eva's body was still preserved, almost exactly as it had been the day she died. Perón kept her body in his dining room. His third wife, Isabel Perón, would reportedly brush Eva's hair and speak to the corpse. It was macabre, surreal, a testament to how thoroughly Eva's image had been mythologized. When Juan Perón returned to Argentina and won the presidency again in 1973, he brought Eva's body back with him. He died in office in 1974, and Isabel, hoping to gain legitimacy by association with Eva, installed both bodies in a crypt in the presidential palace. 2 years later, Another military coup overthrew Isabel. This time, the military showed more respect for Eva's remains. They were returned to the Duarte family. And in 1976, Eva Perón was finally buried in the family crypt at Recoleta Cemetery in Buenos Aires. 24 years after her death, Eva Perón was finally laid to rest. Her tomb is now one of the most visited sites in Buenos Aires, always covered in flowers, left by people who still see her as a saint. What remains of Evita? Eva Perón has been dead for over 70 years, but her presence in Argentina has never faded. Her face appears on currency, giant murals of her adorn government buildings. Politicians still invoke her name, claiming her legacy. But what actually happened in those final months of her life adds layers of complexity to an already complicated story. The lobotomy, performed without her knowledge or consent, was kept secret for decades. It only came to light in the early 2000s when researchers began examining medical records and interviewing doctors who had been involved in her care. The question that haunts the story is, why? Was it purely for pain management, as some defenders claim? The medical literature of the 1950s did support lobotomy as a treatment for intractable cancer pain. Dr. Poppen had performed similar procedures on other terminal cancer patients, but the timing suggests other motives. Eva's increasingly inflammatory rhetoric, her attempts to organize armed militias, her emotional volatility, all of this made her dangerous politically. Juan Perón was walking a tightrope, trying to maintain power against military opposition and economic crisis. A first lady calling for violence and displaying erratic behavior could destabilize everything. Did Perón order the lobotomy to calm her down, to make her manageable in her final weeks? Did he convince himself it was for her own good, that reducing her pain and anxiety justified the procedure? Or was it simply doctors doing what they thought was best with the tools they had available in 1952? We'll never know for certain. Perón never publicly acknowledged the lobotomy. The doctors involved gave conflicting accounts or remained silent. The medical records that might have provided clarity have been lost or destroyed. What we do know is that Eva Perón spent her last weeks in a fog, robbed of the fierce intelligence and will that had defined her. The woman who had climbed from poverty to power, who had fought for the working class with relentless energy, who had refused to be quiet or obedient or anything other than exactly who she chose to be, ended her life with part of her brain destroyed by doctors acting on orders from her husband. The tragedy is multi-layered. There's the obvious tragedy of dying at 33 from a preventable disease. Cervical cancer, which killed Eva and had also killed Juan Perón's first wife, is now largely preventable through screening and vaccination. Eva's death was medically unnecessary by modern standards. There's the tragedy of being kept in the dark about her diagnosis. Eva faced death without understanding what was happening to her, without the chance to make her own decisions about treatment and how she wanted to spend her final months. And there's the tragedy of the lobotomy, of having her personality and behavior altered in the name of pain relief and political stability, of ending her life as something less than the formidable woman she had been. But perhaps the most profound tragedy is how little any of it matters to Eva's legacy. The myths built around her, both positive and negative, have become more powerful than the actual woman ever was. She's been made into a saint by her supporters and a demon by her detractors, and neither version is entirely true. The real Eva Perón was a woman of immense ambition and genuine compassion, capable of both inspiring devotion and ruling through fear. She built hospitals and silenced opposition. She fought for workers' rights and lived in luxury. She was revolutionary and authoritarian, charismatic and calculating. She came from nothing and reached heights that should have been impossible for someone with her background. And when she died, she was mourned by millions who genuinely believed she had changed their lives for the better. The frame of wire and plaster that held her upright at that final parade was just the last in a series of structures that had supported her rise. Her marriage to Perón, the foundation, the carefully cultivated image of glamour and power. All of it was scaffolding for a woman who had learned early that image and reality were equally important, that how people saw you mattered as much as what you actually were. Eva Perón died at 8:25 p.m. on July 26, 1952. But Evita, the myth, the symbol, the legend, has never died. She lives on in the murals and the songs, in the political movements that claim her heritage, in the tourists who visit her tomb and leave flowers. She remains Argentina's most famous daughter, the woman who proved that someone from the Pampas could stand on the world stage. And nothing that happened in those final, painful months, no matter how controversial or tragic, can change the fact that for a brief, shining moment, Eva Perón made millions of people believe that change was possible, that someone who looked like them, who came from where they came from, could rise to power and fight for them. Whether that belief was justified, whether the Peronist movement ultimately helped or hurt Argentina, these are questions that Argentines are still debating. But the power of what Eva represented, the hope she embodied for those who had never had hope before, that was real. And it's why, more than 70 years after her death, we're still talking about a radio actress from Los Toldos who became a First Lady, who built a political movement, who died far too young, and who has never really been laid to rest. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.